Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment is a game I haven't been able to put down since its release about 2 weeks ago. It features some of the most fun combat I've experienced in any game. New mechanics such as zonai devices and sync strikes aren't shallow gimmicks, they deeply impact and in a lot of ways improve upon the by now familiar formula of Hyrule Warriors. Like the previous two Hyrule Warriors games, Age of Imprisonment is a crossover between the Zelda series on one hand and the Dynasty Warriors series on the other. Concretely, this means that the core experience is driven by the Musou gameplay of Dynasty Warriors, where one or a handful of champions take on hundreds of enemies at once. A typical gameplay experience consists of gaining control over a battlefield by conquering strategic points and besting enemy commanders. Everything else, from the characters to the locales to the movesets, the menus and of course the story, is sourced from the Zelda universe. This new installment has seen a relatively quiet launch, with limited promotion and reviews that are about what you'd expect. Praise for the game's technical performance, and the fact that the writers managed to come up with a story that is actually canon this time, with some complaints about its repetitive gameplay. And now we've come to my main reason for making a review of my own. Games like this, meaning pretty much all games with warriors in their title, except for, the warriors, fall into a very specific niche. Musou is a love it or hate it subgenre of hack and slash. Your enjoyment of a given game will depend entirely on whether you buy into a tight enough and repetitive combat loop. So when major outlets review games like this, they tend to run through a basic checklist of whether everything's functional. Does it run at a stable frame rate? Does the story spark joy? Does it look cool at face value? If yes, 8 out of 10. If no, or the reviewer just really happens to hate Musou games in general, you get, video game journalism at its absolute finest. Well, I happen to love Musou games. I'm a big fan of Hyrule Warriors in general and even made a video on why the first game in the spin-off series deserved more respect than I felt it was getting. Over the past 2 weeks, I've managed to play all of the content in Age of Imprisonment, made it through all of the story, achieved 100% map completion, extensively played all the different characters, so I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to go a little more in depth here. With games like this, the devil's often in the detail, so I'd like to explain why the design and new features, while by themselves not that revolutionary, make this, in my view, the most streamlined and coherent Hyrule Warriors experience to date. And I'd like to tell you why, if you're not familiar with Musou games, this might be the one to try. If you appreciate this approach, please consider leaving a like or a comment. I know it's annoying that every video on YouTube has to start this way, but I've experienced firsthand that even a tiny bit of engagement early on can decide whether a video goes on to do great or gets buried immediately. So hitting thumbs up can actually make a huge difference, and you have my genuine thanks if you do. Also, I realize that this game has only been out for a short while, so I will avoid discussing any of the major story beats past the first few missions. But since I do want to go in depth, I will show some late game footage from various missions. I doubt it'll hurt your enjoyment of the game at all, but I'm putting it out there just in case. Alright. Enough with the formalities, let's dive into the world of ancient Hyrule. As I said in the intro, Age of Imprisonment is the third Hyrule Warriors game, but I want to expand on this a little for those who are not so familiar, as this is not as straightforward as you might think. If you're already well familiar with the Hyrule Warriors games, feel free to skip ahead for the next chapter. The first Hyrule Warriors game was released in 2014 for the Wii U console as a collaboration between Koei Tecmo, owner of the Dynasty Warriors franchise, and Nintendo, who of course hold the rights to the Zelda IP. Hyrule Warriors later got ported to the 3DS and the Switch, and thematically it served as sort of an anthology of the Zelda franchise up until that point. It contained references to nearly all the installments in the Zelda series, and as a result the story was a bit of a mess, albeit a fun one, where characters from different eras in the Zelda franchise and even from different art styles all came together. Basically think of this approach as Super Smash Bros., but instead it's focused only on Zelda characters, and the core gameplay is Musou combat. Since this first game was simply titled Hyrule Warriors, to avoid confusion I will refer to it as the Definitive Edition, which is the subtitle of the final Switch port. The second Hyrule Warriors game, subtitled Age of Calamity, was released for the Switch in 2020 and took a very different approach. Instead of being a universal celebration of all things Zelda, it was created specifically as a prequel to the popular mainline Zelda game, Breath of the Wild. This meant the game had a lot more thematic consistency and went out of its way to copy the presentation of Breath of the Wild, right down to its UI and in-game economy, really making Age of Calamity feel like a companion game rather than a series-wide spin-off. While it's known to be the best-selling Musou game to date, Age of Calamity did draw criticism for two major reasons. First, the original Nintendo Switch clearly wasn't capable of rendering that many detailed enemies on screen at the same time. Even if the enemy counts were already lower than in the definitive edition, Age of Calamity was capped at 30 FPS. And even then, it was not able to consistently maintain that frame rate on an original Switch console. Another common criticism was that, while Age of Calamity was marketed as a Breath of the Wild prequel, its story actually deviated from that game quite a lot, making this not a prequel as much as a non-canon what-if story. Breath of the Wild itself eventually got a direct sequel in the form of another mainline Zelda game called Tears of the Kingdom. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment in itself is a prequel to that. So, Age of Imprisonment is not a sequel to Age of Calamity, but rather a prequel to the sequel of the game that Age of Calamity was a prequel to. Quite convoluted, I know, but I'll make it simpler. Age of Imprisonment focuses on a particular storyline from Tears of the Kingdom and just expands on it. I'll briefly explain the premise just so you'll get the basics, but know that it is possible to play and enjoy Age of Imprisonment's mostly self-contained story without having any experience with Tears of the Kingdom. But just to get you up to speed, in the opening sequence of Tears of the Kingdom, Link and Zelda find the corpse of their eternal foe Ganondorf in a crypt underneath Hyrule Castle. When the corpse comes back to life and attacks the two, Link gets badly wounded and Zelda falls into a chasm. Tears of the Kingdom then follows Link for the rest of the game as he regains his strength and gathers allies for the final confrontation against Ganondorf. Through flashback cutscenes, we learn that Zelda was sent back to the distant past, to the time of Hyrule's founding. It was during this time that the power-hungry Gerudo warlord Ganondorf was originally defeated and sealed away in the tomb we find him in at the start of the game. The events surrounding this are known as the Imprisoning War. What Age of Imprisonment actually does is take this moment at the start of Tears of the Kingdom and ask, what if, instead of following Link, we follow Zelda's point of view? After all, since there's an actual war going on, it's a perfect scenario for a Musou game. It's got all the ingredients. Lots of enemies, open battlefields, never-ending action, high stakes. This approach is quite similar to Age of Calamity, which, likewise, portrayed the war that took place a century before Breath of the Wild, albeit with tons of creative liberty down the line. So there you have it. Age of Imprisonment is the third Hyrule Warriors game, but it's also specifically a companion game to Tears of the Kingdom. As I said, Age of Imprisonment does tell a self-contained story that can be enjoyed on its own merit, but there will be some aspects of the story that won't become fully clear until you play both games. Initially, Age of Imprisonment being so similar in approach to Age of Calamity had me a bit worried that it would not offer enough of a new experience. After all, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom share the same art style and to a large degree the same game world. This means that both Age of Calamity and Age of Imprisonment are drawing from the same source material. It's also bad news for those fans out there who are growing tired of the Breath Wildification of the Zelda franchise, but this is something that's beyond Age of Imprisoment's control. And sure, the Switch 2 hardware allowing this game to run at 60 frames per second and with more enemies on screen is a huge boon, but especially with its high price tag, you'd expect something more than what could essentially have been a free Age of Calamity performance patch. Having immensely enjoyed both the Definitive Edition and Age of Calamity, I was sort of hyped for this new Hyrule Warriors game, but I was also a bit skeptical. I played Age of Calamity, and after finishing its storyline, I felt little motivation to engage in its post-game, like I did with the Definitive Edition. If Age of Imprisonment was just more of the same, would I even make it through the main story this time? You bet I did. Like I said earlier, with Musou games, the devil's in the detail. And despite its outward similarities with Age of Calamity, Age of Imprisonment has a bunch of clever additions and features smarter design choices than its predecessor. That, as it turns out, was all that was needed to turn this more cinematic approach into a winning formula. We'll start with the most eye-catching new gameplay option, Sync Strikes. These all-new attacks allow you to combine the strengths of your heroes, generating powerful attacks that can really decimate mobs of enemies or cut into a boss character's health bar. These attacks will vary based on the combination of characters at play. Zelda and Rauru will shoot powerful beams of light, whereas doing a sync strike with Minoru might see you controlling a Zonai construct that can pound enemies to dust. They effectively operate as joint ultimate abilities, where the sync bars of characters charge up the more time they spend in each other's vicinity. While they're the mechanic that'll draw the most attention, these sync strikes are just the tip of the iceberg. When you group your characters together in order to let these sync bars fill up, you'll quickly find out that the game constantly encourages you to swap characters mid-combat. When an enemy charges at you with a strong attack and you don't have the ability to counter it, a nearby ally will often volunteer to do it instead. The game will give you a prompt to then switch to that character, and you can continue hacking away at your foe from their angle. Characters will also offer to hit enemies when they have a good opening, allowing for what you could call multi-character combos. Even if another hero in your roster has moved to a different part of the map, they will often notify you when they're in an important fight, so you'll know to switch to them and dive straight into the action. Normally it might be a challenge to switch between characters constantly if you haven't had time to learn their movesets. Luckily, this blow is softened considerably by the Zonai devices. This ancient tech is a new addition to Hyrule Warriors, and it has been copied directly from Tears of the Kingdom. Zonai devices include items such as rockets, flamethrowers, bombs, and fans. These devices can be used directly to, for example, electrocute enemies, but they can also be used in concert with the environment or even each other to create chain reactions. Zonai devices can be ridiculously strong, and I wouldn't advise sleeping on them. You can do a lot of damage if you use the right tools under the right circumstances. For example, using a frost emitter can decimate fire-based enemies, while you can use electricity to turn bodies of water into area of effect damage pools, frying all the enemies who stand in it. Even more importantly, these Zonai devices can be used to fill gaps in your arsenal. For example, a lot of enemies in the Lanayru region are covered in sludge, and if you have a champion with a water-based moveset, such as the Zora Queen Kia, you can make quick work of these foes by washing the sludge of them and rendering them more vulnerable to your attacks. But suppose that Kia's not in your roster, either because she's not available for that mission or you simply didn't think to include her. Then you can use the Hydron Zonai device to give these gamers a bath instead. It's slightly less effective an approach, so you still have an incentive to select Kia, but your attack plan is not rendered completely toothless either. These devices act as the great equalizer, not fully undermining the strengths of each character, but rather covering potential weak spots in your arsenal, or your familiarity with a champion's moveset. They are universal tools that give every one of your characters the ability to adapt to any situation on the battlefield. When you take these different new mechanics, such as the Zonai devices, the sync strikes, and the multi-character combos, and put them all together, you get a whole new dynamic to the way the game plays. Even when you're the only player, almost every battle feels like a team effort. Strictly speaking, you're not obligated to make full use of all of these new tools, but I will say that in Age of Imprisonment, sticking religiously to one or two characters is downright suboptimal. And this hasn't always been the case in Hyrule Warriors, not to this extent at least. If you've ever seen or read anything about Age of Imprisonment before watching this review, you probably weren't surprised by me bringing up the sync strikes. They were at the forefront of the marketing that Nintendo did do, and in both previews and reviews of the game, they were the most discussed new mechanic by some distance. Pretty much everyone understood that this was to be the new feature of this installment. And even still, I think their central role in the way the entire game plays out is understated or even misunderstood by some. So I want to dive a little deeper, go into the game's mission structure, and show you how it differs from previous installments. This will require some explanation, so bear with me. While covering Age of Imprisonment surrounding its release, some gaming outlets speculated that the presence of sync strikes would mean that, As the player, you would have to make strategic decisions about whether to split up your champions or keep them together. This would have been true had Age of Imprisonment been structured like the Definitive Edition. The first Hyrule Warriors game was still set up like a traditional Dynasty Warriors game. The challenge didn't necessarily come from the question of whether or not you'd be able to beat this or that enemy, but rather from being able to prioritize your tasks on the fly. The typical Definitive Edition experience, and in many ways the typical Musou gameplay, is as follows. You are dropped on a big battlefield with about 10 keeps held by 2 to 3 different factions, one of those factions being your own. Your first impulse will be to just start taking those keeps and claim them for your own faction. But shortly after the game starts, you'll be bombarded with additional missions and warnings. A keep saboteur is heading towards one of your keeps. Stop him. Your home base is being bombarded by the enemy. Stop the bombardment or lose the fight. An enemy recruiter has targeted one of your specialists. Prevent him from making your specialist betray your faction. In the Definitive Edition, there could easily be a dozen of these missions active all at once, and it would be physically impossible to complete each and every one of them. Therefore, it was important to prioritize the most important missions and spread your champions across different parts of the map, to fight efficiently and put out all these little fires before they'd grow beyond your control. Had the new Hyrule Warriors game actually been built around strategic micromanagement, sync strikes would have posed a real dilemma for those trying to optimize each battle. The reality is, however, that the second game, Age of Calamity, for the most part already did away with this aspect of the gameplay. Opting for a more cinematic approach, the battlefields were still open and you could still distribute your characters around it as you pleased, but this ultimately proved more of an optional time-saving strategy than an absolute necessity to prevent defeat. Instead of juggling a bunch of quests of varying urgency, you would, in most instances, just move from map marker to map marker, clearing whichever objective was needed to progress the main mission at hand. In the entire main questline of Age of Calamity, there were maybe 2 or 3 moments where I needed to send backup to an outpost to prevent losing it and the mission. And even those moments were nothing like the chaos that would unfold in the Definitive Edition on the regular. Now, I don't think that the more linear approach of Age of Calamity was necessarily worse. The game went for a more cinematic experience, and having a more predictable order of events can help elevate that. However, it did introduce some new issues. In the Definitive Edition, I felt a lot more motivated to have multiple good characters. This meant investing in characters to have all key abilities and buffs unlocked, a good weapon, and for them to be at a good enough level relative to my progress in the game. It also meant that I'd spend time to learn their unique movesets. So when I'd switch between characters to clear different parts of the map, I wouldn't get caught with my pants down because I was crouching on just my one favorite character. In Age of Calamity, a lot of this incentive was lost because there just wasn't much need to switch between characters during most missions. Some missions did have restrictions on which heroes you could pick from, but since I mostly just stuck to Zelda and Link, the 2 main characters who appeared in most story missions, I never felt the need to give the less essential champions a chance, and I never did extensively try many of them, bar a few exceptions such as Urbosa. This also made the post-game a bit problematic, because why would I invest in earning more health and skills for a character I don't intend on playing a whole lot? Then some missions forced me to play a certain underleveled character and I just kinda lost interest. The reason I'm explaining all this is because Age of Imprisonment, while having similar linear gameplay, solves this issue almost entirely. As I explained earlier, the sync strikes and the underlying design that revolves around frequent character switching ensures that, as a player, you are once again stimulated to spread your time and resources across different champions. They achieve this without upending the cinematic structure of Age of Calamity and reverting to a more classic Musou design. This may all seem a bit technical, so let me illustrate this with a concrete example. Zelda is my favorite character in the franchise, so in both Age of Calamity and Age of Imprisonment, she'd always be my first pick for key missions. But where in Age of Calamity I'd happily go for 30 plus minutes just playing as Zelda, in Age of Imprisonment I often found myself going through my entire playable roster for that event, which, depending on the mission, usually ranges from 2 to 4 champions at a time. I'd often set out to stick to one champion to practice some combos or do some character-specific side quest, only to find myself on a completely different character 3 minutes into the mission. In short, if I wanted to play as Zelda for a full half-hour long mission again, now I had to actively resist the game constantly tempting me to swap characters. Switching things up felt more rewarding, and the addition of the universally available Zonai devices made it so that I wasn't too harshly punished for not yet knowing the finer details of a secondary character's moveset. It's also important for me to stress that, despite this heavy focus on character swapping in the game, none of it feels forced. I was not even fully aware of this focus until, a few hours in, I noticed that I was actively maintaining every character on my roster, going out of my way to keep each of them geared up and near the maximum level available to me at the time. At first, I thought that, well, maybe I just like these characters more than in Age of Calamity, but it was too early in the game for me to have settled on such a strong preference either which way. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the game was making it worth my while to have each character ready to crush some bad guys. Each of the characters also has its own set of so-called aside missions, which are almost like those typical MMO daily quests, with some examples being perform 2 special attacks as Zelda, defeat 200 enemies as Ardi, or deploy Rauru and Kalamo in a battle together. These are all fairly straightforward tasks with pretty good rewards, but that just goes to show how it pays off, sometimes literally, to rotate between characters constantly. So, if you were understandably worried that sync strikes were going to be just a new gimmicky feature that would add limited variation, worry no longer. As it turns out, they are simply the most visible part of an underlying design philosophy that makes it more rewarding to switch things up constantly and to use the full width of your roster. And, on the topic of the character roster, as I just explained, Age of Imprisonment goes out of its way to motivate you to swap between characters. Another effect of this approach is that it made me appreciate the less prominent side characters a lot more. Being more motivated to switch to these characters, I quickly grew familiar with the unique feel and value of each of them. There don't appear to be any real copycat characters. They all manage to put their own distinct spin on how they handle fights, ranging from their core movesets to their sync strikes and unique strong attacks. They also managed to come up with new characters that instantly feel like they belong in the universe. This is not a given, since the Hyrule Warriors series is not developed by Nintendo itself, but rather by studios that fall under Koei Tecmo. Especially in the Definitive Edition, this led to a sort of culture clash where the original characters they added to the star-studded Zelda cast seemed out of place, albeit in more of an amusing way than a jarring one. Age of Calamity, meanwhile, largely relied on characters already introduced in Breath of the Wild. Age of Imprisonment, however, introduces a fairly big number of original characters. This was born out of necessity because the game takes place in the far past, so it would be canonically nonsensical for franchise mainstays such as Impa, Link, or even Beedle to be present there. Many of the new characters are representatives of the different races of Hyrule. Pinnock and Vance are Rito warriors, Pastos and Breton represent the Gorons, Zora have Lago and Catalan, and in the Gerudo region we are introduced to Shelani and Ronza. The Hylians also have their own newcomers, Kino and Typhon. The fact that I even know all of these names by memory shows how much time I've spent with every one of them, because I am truly terrible at remembering names. All of these characters are commanders or other prominent members of their respective peoples, but they are by no means chosen heroes. Rather, their backstories serve to raise the stakes by depicting what such an epic war must be like for normal people. Despite the exposition on these characters being reserved to select in-game text and mission briefings, they do serve a storytelling purpose in allowing players to empathize with the struggle against Ganondorf more easily. Normally, Link is the character through whom players connect to the story of a given Legend of Zelda game, but seeing as he is not here, this is handled by adding more everyday folk to the roster. And I think it's worked out pretty well. I even saw a post floating around on X where someone was complaining about how these side characters don't really play a role in the main story, yet most of the replies were people saying things like, "Shut up, Lago's great, leave Pastos out of this," or "Don't you dare slander Ronza and Shelani." It's anecdotal, but to me it's an indication that a lot of people have been able to connect with these characters, despite or perhaps even because of their limited impact on the story. Oh yeah, we should probably get into the story. One of the first questions that fans wanted to know when Age of Imprisonment was announced was, is the story going to be canon this time? This question was relevant because the answer turned out to be a resounding no for the previous Hyrule Warriors game. Age of Calamity, being a prequel, started out depicting events as they were seen in flashbacks of Breath of the Wild. This put the writers in a difficult spot because the Kingdom of Hyrule that you explore in Breath of the Wild is, in essence, a post-apocalyptic world. It may not look the part, but it's a Hyrule that was overrun by the forces of Ganon, with its king slain, its hero missing, and its princess locked in stasis for 100 years, preventing the force of evil from spilling out across the land and dealing the final blow to Hyrule. Civilization is found few and far between, with ruins littered across rolling plains, patrolled by monsters, and the powerful technology that had turned on Hyrule at a pivotal moment. In short, a prequel leading into these events was going to be rather bleak, but when it was time to face that reality, Age of Calamity's story instead took a turn and found a way to conjure up something of a happy ending. Had Age of Calamity been its own isolated story, no one would have batted an eye, but there were players and critics alike who felt cheated by the premise of a prequel that, when push came to shove, flinched and headed into a safer, more cheerful direction. Well, in short, Age of Imprisonment is indeed canon. Its story aligns with the events that we know from Tears of the Kingdom and adds depth to them. As stated previously, it is by and large the same story, just from a different character's perspective. I'm sure there are lore nerds out there who can find inconsistencies, but by and large, there's at least the intention on the writer's part to stay true to the source material. I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume that this decision is not just a result of negative feedback to the previous installment story, but also Tears of the Kingdom lending itself a lot better to a true prequel. Without spoiling too much about that game, while its story is also filled with tragedy, sacrifice, and plenty of bittersweet feelings in between, its story is ultimately more hopeful and less desperate than Breath of the Wild was. This is true both for the game's actual story and the events leading up to it. What's more, if there's one common complaint I've read about Tears of the Kingdom, it's that its story could be a bit bare bones at times. The game featured visions of ancient sages, chosen heroes representing different elements, who aided King Rauru in his battle against Ganondorf during the Imprisoning War. And the only time we really see them is in almost copy-pasted cutscenes where they relay basic information about said war to Link and one of the new sages. We didn't get to know their names or even get to see their faces, let alone that we learned anything about their personalities. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, and I will probably discuss Breath of the Wild and or Tears of the Kingdom in a separate video sometime, but suffice it to say that, narratively speaking, Tears of the Kingdom proved fertile ground for writers tasked with adding more depth to its premise and characters without tinkering too much with established lore. As such, one aspect of the story in Age of Imprisonment is just letting us spend a bit more time with the sages and learning how they became the chosen champions of their respective peoples. We get to know the Sage of Water as Kia, who became Queen of the Zora people after her father was killed by Ganondorf's forces. We are also introduced to the Sage of Lightning, Ardi, who starts off waging war against Hyrule until she is betrayed by her chieftain Ganondorf. And even if the boisterous Sage of Fire, Agrestan, and the cocky Sage of Wind, Rafika, display personality traits that we've come to expect from their respective cultures, it's nice to get a bit more mileage out of these characters than just a few rehashed lines of dialogue. While this more substantial approach to characters we sort of knew is very welcome indeed, the true highlight of Age of Imprisonment's narrative is the addition of two new characters. First we have Kalamo, who is a Korok. Koroks are, in short, small wooden beings who are spread across Hyrule and are associated with ancient forest spirits. Traditionally serving as side characters in fetch quests throughout various Zelda games, Kalamo is the first time that one of these benign woodland imps takes the center stage. As a Korok, his true aim is to find the perfect spot to take root, in hopes of one day becoming a large tree and the center of his own forest. This mission, of course, proves difficult when the entirety of Hyrule is at risk of being eliminated by the evil presence of Ganondorf. Fortunately, Kalamo has a secret weapon, quite literally. During one of his adventures, he accidentally activates a mysterious construct that, as it happens, bears a striking resemblance to Link. I'll leave it up to you to play the game and uncover the exact nature of this construct, but while it's no rocket science, not proverbially at least, I found it a rather elegant solution to put a Link-like figure, and a rather cool one at that, in a game that, for canonical reasons, cannot feature the actual Link. Initially, the back and forth between Kalamo and the construct comes off as a bit of comic relief. where the Korok begrudgingly gets dragged into dangerous fights by a construct he has less control over than he might wish. This leads to many of the game's more amusing situations, and it's pretty refreshing that between all these characters who speak of honor, duty, and destiny, we have at least one person who just really does not want to be there and is not ashamed to remind everyone of this all the time. He can sometimes even be heard protesting when you switch to his character mid-battle.
Ask someone else.
From a gameplay point of view, it's already obvious that Calamo and the Construct are here to do more than just make us laugh. Even though I can honestly say that none of the 19 playable characters feels like an afterthought in terms of their moveset and functionality, both Calamo and the Construct already struck me as particularly fleshed out champions early on. Calamo has a unique moveset that involves him throwing all kinds of items such as bombs, fruits and even beehives at his opponents. This effectively turns him into a reliable all-rounder who can unleash attacks of different elemental types onto his enemies. In accordance with his role in the story, the Construct fills the void of Link with its combat role as well, being the only character that's able to switch between different weapon types and styles, but otherwise serving as the jack-of-all-trades swordsman that Link was in the previous Hyrule Warriors games. You'll get enough use out of the remarkable duo with these movesets as is, but there are even entire on-rails shooter sections that see Calamo controlling the Construct, much like the R-Wing fighters from the Star Fox franchise. Hyrule Warriors games traditionally feature offbeat sections such as this, where the steady rhythm of the Musou gameplay is interrupted for something rather different. The Definitive Edition saw you play as Ganon, and Age of Calamity featured levels where you controlled the Divine Beasts. I always considered those sections to be among the less appealing parts of said games. They were mostly novelties that wore off after a few minutes. The Construct shooter sections, on the other hand, are super engaging and well thought out. I actually looked forward to playing these whenever they came up. There weren't too many of these missions, they didn't overstay their welcome, and they kept introducing new mechanics to maintain the element of surprise. In short, a perfect addition to the main gameplay loop. Suffice to say, the developers did a lot to make Calamo and the Construct stick out, both in terms of gameplay and story. Zelda is still very much the main character of this game, and the sage's fight against Ganondorf is the event that it ultimately revolves around, but what starts out as a bit of a lighthearted side narrative develops into an engaging B-story that gets surprisingly emotional at one point, and is beautifully woven into the main storyline in the end. This part of the game honestly took me by surprise, as it proved to give a wonderful twist to a story of which I already knew the conclusion. In general, the story is likely to give some solace to those of you who thought Tears of the Kingdom cut too many corners with its limited exposition, or simply couldn't get enough of that universe and wanted more. Do mind though that the storytelling in Hyrule Warriors is different from the mainline series, where The Legend of Zelda is usually quite implicit, with Link being the observer of the game's events as much as he is the participant in them. Hyrule Warriors has always been rather chatty, if not outright bombastic in its treatment of Hyrulean lore. There is a lot more dialogue, and cinematically, some fights look like they're pulled straight out of Dragon Ball Z, and not a Zen-like fantasy game. This aplomb is amplified all the more by Zelda being the central character of this story, and she's of course a lot more vocal than Link. She shares her insights, her doubts, and her wisdom with those around her, making for a story that appears more involved, but might also feel less open to interpretation. All in all, I think they did a great job of striking a balance and came up with a story that feels engaging and at times even surprising, but ultimately respects the source material much more than Age of Calamity did. So, I realize I've been heaping praise on Age of Imprisonment, and that's not without reason. I enjoyed my hours with the game, and I can assure you there were many. Still, just to be thorough, I do want to address some of the problems I've had with the game. These critiques are comparatively minor in nature when compared to all the things that this new Hyrule Warriors installment does so well, but I feel like they're worth mentioning. The one thing I was missing in Age of Imprisonment when compared to its predecessors is customizability. The Definitive Edition especially had plenty of outfits you could collect for each character, and since many of them were obtained in the post-game, it gave you something to work towards long after the story was done and dusted. The game also had multiple different weapon styles available for many of the characters, which would often totally alter the way you'd play them. Although Age of Calamity was already a lot more limited in this regard, it still had some outfit options and different weapon styles for some of the more prominent characters. In Age of Imprisonment, however, there's almost none of this. Characters generally play and look the way they do from the moment you unlock them. You are able to unlock new moves for each character, but these are just enhancements of their pre-existing movesets, and they do not fundamentally alter the way in which you play them. The only exception is the Construct, who can choose between 3 different weapon types. None of the characters appear to have costumes you can switch between, though. Zelda is seen in 2 different outfits depending on where you are in the story, but you cannot freely switch between them. It would be nice if future DLC or updates could address this and add a bit more depth, cosmetic or otherwise, to existing characters. Personally, I would prefer this over having a bunch of new characters added. Some additions would even be super simple, like being able to toggle off the lavish ceremonial masks that the sages wear in battle. We already see them without these masks during cutscenes, so it would not be too big of an ask. Perhaps a more fundamental gameplay issue arises from how often the game encourages you to switch characters. As we've discussed, this mostly leads to a better experience, but it does come at the cost of one thing: special attacks. In addition to sync strikes, each character also has an individual ultimate that they can charge separately, called a special attack. However, you only charge this special attack while actively fighting as that character. And since you will likely be dividing your playtime between multiple champions, it can take rather long before one of them gets one of their special attack meters filled. Each character can have up to 3 special attack meters, but the only time I've seen all 3 of them filled on a character was when I paid to do so at one of the camps on the battlefield. Even when I did have special attacks available to me, they often felt underpowered. In Definitive Edition and Age of Calamity, special attacks could be game changers, taking a considerable chunk of health out of boss characters, making the ordeal more manageable. In Age of Imprisonment, nearly every boss character hides behind an elemental weakness gauge, which causes their health bars to barely budge when you perform a special attack on them. With sync strikes charging faster, being stronger and looking more spectacular, it appears that they've supplanted the special attack in terms of battlefield utility. It's not enough to hurt your gameplay experience in a significant way, but it was noticeable enough for me to mention it here. Something that will potentially hurt your gameplay experience is the difficulty, or rather, the lack thereof. For my first playthrough of any game, I usually play on normal. I'm not some god-tier gamer, and especially in Musou games, I enjoy the power fantasy of annihilating hundreds of enemies too much to want to turn the tougher opponents into damage sponges. For the Definitive Edition and Age of Calamity, this proved a good enough approach. Things never really got that difficult, but there were moments of moderate challenge that kept me on my toes. In Age of Imprisonment, I feel like the normal difficulty is quite a bit too easy. What I mean by that is that I think the time to kill is mostly fine. As said, I don't like damage sponges that take ages to defeat and interrupt the flow of battle, but the incoming damage to the player could be a bit higher. Throughout my playthrough, meaning literally all content in the entire game, I haven't died once. And even in those rare moments where I did start taking significant amounts of damage, I had enough health items to pull through without breaking a sweat, or I could simply swap to a character that was still at full health. At this point, I'm at or close to max level with all of my characters, so I can't properly emulate a hard or very hard difficulty playthrough without starting a new game, which I really don't want to do. From what I've read though, the gap between normal and hard is quite sizable, where on hard difficulty the time to kill is so high that it just takes an eternity to down some of the tougher enemies. I can't confirm this for myself though, so if you're gearing up for your first playthrough, you might want to experiment with your difficulty settings a bit just to see what works for you. And no, none of these issues ultimately put a dent in my enjoyment of the game, which was constant and thorough, but it does go to show that Musou games, while their premise may seem simple, walk on a tightrope as far as balancing is concerned, which may easily lead to tiny oversights such as the ones I mentioned. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment shows that you don't need to reinvent the wheel in order to make a great game. It's not a revolution, but rather an evolution of the concept they introduced in the previous game. A more streamlined, cinematic Musou game that wants to tell an interesting story as much as it wants you to smack an infinite number of bad guys. In drawing the right lessons from Age of Calamity, they managed to make a game that looks and feels similar, but for the most part plays way better. The combat especially has never felt better in Hyrule Warriors, and the emphasis on switching between characters helps craft an experience that feels fresh and surprising without abandoning the series' core principles. For sure, the movesets are some of the best in the series so far. Whether it's Zelda's elegant, lightsaber-esque combat, Mineru's creative use of Zonai devices, or Artie's juicy lightning attacks. I'm more confident than ever to say that if you still consider Hyrule Warriors to just be about mindless button mashing, you are really doing yourself a disservice in not getting the most out of this game. Meanwhile, the on-rails shooting sections provide a welcome breath of fresh air in between all the pummeling of the ground troops, and almost appear to me as Koei Tecmo's open application to develop the long-awaited next game in the Star Fox series. Video game stories are still a matter of taste, especially when it comes to a contentious IP such as The Legend of Zelda, but I personally think they did an amazing job at telling a familiar story with surprising twists and well-earned emotional beats. Especially Calamo can stand toe-to-toe with the most memorable characters in the Zelda franchise at large. And you'd be forgiven for thinking the subtitle of this game is actually Age of Calamo. Also, I know that there will be plenty of you who long for the approach of the original Hyrule Warriors, and would like a new installment where it's an anthology of the Zelda series once again. I would also find it interesting, but at the same time, I find it fascinating how Age of Imprisonment shows how far the Hyrule Warriors concept has come in its own right. What started out as a quirky crossover idea has by now turned into its own spin-off series, with this latest game likely being the capstone on the Breath of the Wild era, so far the longest continuous iteration of the Legend of Zelda franchise. Finally, in a further attempt to show the game's value to the Zelda IP as a whole, I want to emphasize that Age of Imprisonment marks the second year in a row that Zelda gets to be the protagonist in one of her own games. When I first started playing the Zelda series, Zelda herself was still mostly a damsel in distress, an archetypical European-style princess who served as a symbol of purity rather than a fully fledged character of her own. Yet, over the years, I've seen her be developed into someone with agency and a multifaceted, oftentimes relatable personality. There's an argument to be made that, in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Zelda already was the main character, if not a playable one. And while in last year's Echoes of Wisdom, Zelda was playable, she functioned narratively as a stand-in for Link, that is, a silent protagonist through which the player interprets the game world. Age of Imprisonment is the first time where she's the undisputed main character in a Zelda-adjacent game, and gets to voice all of her thoughts, as she often has done as a deuteragonist already. I just wanted to point this out in my conclusion because I have a strong feeling that, with Echoes of Wisdom and now Age of Imprisonment, Nintendo is A/B testing whether Zelda can carry a mainline Zelda game as a protagonist or co-protagonist. This would in turn emphasize the increasing relevance of Hyrule Warriors to the overall Zelda IP. We shall see how it all pans out in the end. As for Age of Imprisonment itself, it's an extremely well designed game. I really wanted to get this review out there and make the case that a lot more thought went into its underlying mechanics and structure than may be apparent at first. I know that big gaming outlets are doomed to stick to the basics, but that just leaves space for smaller channels such as my own to do more of a deep dive. Anyway, enough yapping. Age of Imprisonment is peak. If you have switched to, go play it, and if you enjoyed my review, don't forget the usual liking, subscribing, and all that good stuff. The algorithm demands a sacrifice. Thank you so much for watching. See you later. And oh yeah, make Lenalia a playable character, please.